Hey coders, this is Ben, founder and CEO of Holoscribe, back for lesson 3, this time focusing on HTML semantics. So if you've been following along, the first 2 lessons covered some of the basics of HTML, including going through some of the elements and structures that you need to know to start implementing the building blocks of building your own website. And in the last lesson, Codecademy took us through building out basic tables and forms. By the end of the HTML tables lesson, you should now be familiar with how to create a table, how to add rows and data to your table, and define things like table headings, table borders, the table body, table head, and the table footer. We also began to dabble in CSS as we applied some basic styling to our tables as well. Over to the forms. There was 2 parts of the forms lesson. The first was to build the form, and we went through a process of building Davy's burger form where we set up the form, put some text inputs, added labels, added number inputs, put in some sliders, some checkbox inputs, some radio button inputs, and we even added a drop-down list. We also added in the button to submit the form and made sure that we put in the parameters to tell the form where to submit the information that it was collecting off users. The final part of last lesson was to look at form validation. So this is where we took the forms that we can now create, and we were able to specify which form fields required inputs, setting minimum and maximum character counts for the forms, checking text length, and adding other rules to make sure that the information we capture on the forms we build is exactly what we need. This week, we're moving on to Semantic HTML. This is the last lesson in Codecademy's introduction to HTML before we move on to some basic CSS, which is going to allow us to style by changing the colors and the fonts and other elements of the HTML pages that we've been building. And before we get into the Codecademy lessons, I just want to talk a little bit more about what Semantic HTML actually means. Now, it may seem a little bit of a confusing term, but it's actually quite simple. The word semantic means that it relates to meaning. So a semantic element basically means that it's a HTML element where the name tells you what it's used for. Over the last few weeks, without even knowing it, you've already been using a mixture of non-semantic and semantic HTML elements. And to give you a really clear example of the difference, when we've been adding things like a div or a span HTML element, that's non-semantic because div and span doesn't actually give you any meaning about what's going inside those tags. Whereas elements like header and footer, and we've done ones like heading, paragraphs, and images and videos, they're semantic HTML because the actual element itself gives you meaning about what is going inside those tags. So to summarize, semantic HTML, the actual element defines the meaning of what's going in, and non-semantic HTML just means anything can go in it really, and you don't get a lot of meaning from the actual element used. But why is this important? And why is Codecademy dedicating a whole lesson just to covering this? Well, there's 3 main reasons, and Codecademy goes into these as well, but just to touch on them briefly. The first reason to try and use semantic elements whenever possible. So in other words, adding in elements that have meaning, such as headings and paragraphs, is because of accessibility. Now, what that means is that basically we're helping the HTML to be more readable for mobile devices and for things like browsers and screen readers. This helps not only the page to look and be structured better, but it also helps people with disability who have to enable accessibility options. So the screen readers in the page can bring more meaning to the content on it. The second reason the Codecademy goes into around why semantic elements is important is around SEO, which is search engine optimization. Basically, search engines like Google can read and interpret semantic elements more than they can non-semantic elements. And what that's going to do is help the search engine understand your content better, which is overall going to improve your search ranking. So if you're trying to build a web page and you want to be noticed and found on search engines, it's best to use semantic elements as much as possible so that you have stronger search engine optimization. The last and final reason to touch on over why you want to learn how to use semantic elements as much as possible is simply that it's easier to understand your code. And whether it's for you, whether it's for someone reviewing your code, or whether it's for you reviewing somebody else's code, having semantic elements is always a much faster way to get up to speed with what the code is trying to do. And equally important, it's going to help you to be a faster coder. The other advantage of using it is that when it comes to debugging or trying to find out what's going wrong with your code so you can fix some bugs, semantic elements often make it much, much easier to dive into the right part of the code to figure out what's going on. Take, for example, some of the projects we work on where we can have anywhere up to 50,000 or more lines of code. If every one of the elements used is non-semantic, so things like divs and spans all over the place, and we know that something's going wrong, it could be any one of those 50,000 or so divs and spans that could be causing the issue. Whereas if we use semantic elements, let's say we define a table and we see something going wrong with our table, well, we know that in the 50,000 lines of code, we can jump straight to the table parts and figure out what's actually going on. So as you jump into Codecademy this week, you'll see that in your overall syllabus of learning HTML, we've now completed the elements and structures, the tables, the forms, and we've just got the one interactive lesson to work on with Semantic HTML. Essentially, it's going to be getting you to do activities, pretty much reusing the stuff you've learned in the previous weeks, but this time just making sure you understand and implement Semantic HTML as much as possible. It's going to cover things like headers and navs, the main parts and footers of your HTML. It's going to look at articles and sections, aside elements, figures and fig captions, audio and attributes, and videos and embeds. By the time you finish this lesson, not only would you have had a refresher in some of your HTML elements and structures, also dabbling into a little bit of the tables and forms again, but you will now have a better understanding around how to use semantic HTML to make your code cleaner and more easy to read for some of the most common HTML elements they're going to use. As this is the last HTML lesson in our introduction to HTML, before we move on to CSS, I want to throw out a HTML challenge to all of you that have followed so far. We've learned a lot on Codecademy already. Codecademy has been great for giving us some working examples as we're going through the exercises. We've been building out different HTML pages that it sets us. But what I want to throw out the challenge is for you to build your own HTML file. Under the video, we provided a link to download a very, very simple template HTML file. I'm going to quickly show you the instructions for once you've downloaded that file, how you can open it, use it, and begin to implement some of the HTML skills you've learned in your own HTML file on your own computer. So you can see now on my Mac, I have downloaded the file that's going to be provided to you underneath the YouTube video. It's a file called hello.html. Now there's two things we're going to do with this file. First, we're going to open it in a code editor. Now you can use any simple text editor, such as TextEdit or Notes, but I do recommend that if you're getting serious about coding, you go down and download a free editor tool called Sublime Text. And again, the links to those will be under this video. And the first thing you're going to do, once you have your code editor ready, you're going to right click on the HTML file, you're going to go open with, and you're going to select it from the files that are suggested. You can see I'm using Sublime Text, and there we are, I've opened up my HTML. Now in the starting document, we've already added a few elements just to help you along your way. Most of this stuff you've done already in your Codecademy lessons. But you can see at the top, we've defined the document type as HTML. We've opened and closed the HTML tag. We've even put inside a body. And with inside the body, we've added your first two elements, a heading 1 and a paragraph. So now that you've got your code open in your code editor, there's one more thing to do. That is to go back to the file that you downloaded, to right click on it again, to go open with, and this time select your default browser. I'm using Google Chrome. So when I open that up, I can now see my heading and my paragraph in my HTML file. What I can do is I can easily Command Tab, or if you're on a Windows machine, Alt Tab, between the two windows, I can switch back to my HTML. As I add elements in, or I edit the elements that I've got, I can then click Save, switch back to my browser, refresh, and I can see the changes as I build out my own page. So back to the challenge for this week. Your challenge is to download the HTML template file we're provided. If you don't have one already, to download code editor such as Sublime, open up your HTML in Sublime, open it up in your browser, and begin to implement some of the Codecademy elements that you've been learning over the last few weeks. Get creative and add in any content that you're interested in, but try and use as many HTML elements as you can think of. Headings, paragraphs, unstructured lists, structured lists, images, videos, forms, tables. Go nuts, add as much as you can. We'd love to see your results, so screenshot the HTML pages that you create, throw them into the comments of the YouTube link. Let us know if you get stuck with any questions, and we'll try and help out as we can. Have a great week in your last lesson on HTML basics, and we look forward to chatting next week when we get into CSS.